If you'd like to learn a color grading workflow inside Premiere Pro that helps you get the best results from whatever footage happens to be in front of you, then this is the video for you. My name is Alistair, and in this video, I'm going to be unpacking my exact color grading workflow that I use for all of my client work. I'm going to be diving into each tool, showing you what it does, where it fits into my process, and along the way, I'm going to try and sprinkle in as many tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years as possible. And what I hope for you to get out of this video is for you to either establish a workflow to begin with, because there are benefits to having one, or just see an improvement in your existing color grading workflow. So if that sounds good to you, if you're keen for that, let's go ahead and get into Premiere. Alrighty, so step one of my process is to convert my log footage into Rec. 709. And to do this, there are two main approaches. I can either one, override the media color space of my footage right here from inside Premiere Pro by right-clicking my clip, selecting modify, then choosing color, and then selecting my picture profile from this drop-down list. Once I hit OK, my footage pops into Rec. 709 and I'm done. Now, if you don't see your picture profile listed from this dropdown, then you're going to need to use the second approach, which is to use a Rec. 709 conversion LUT. And you can easily find these by typing your camera model and picture profile followed by Rec. 709 conversion LUT into Google. If one of the search results is from your official camera manufacturer's website, I'd highly recommend choosing that option, as that is going to give you the most accurate reproduction of color from your camera's footage. From there, download the conversion LUT and apply it to your raw footage to bring it into Rec. 709. And just like that, we have a good base to start building our color grade on. Now, I want to pause for just a moment to address some suboptimal advice I've seen over the years here on YouTube, which is where some people that are teaching color grading videos are suggesting that in order to prepare log footage for grading, you just need to increase saturation and contrast. The logic being, if log footage or even hybrid log gamma footage lacks saturation and contrast, then we can just increase it here and we're good to go. I'm afraid it isn't that simple. A conversion LUT is mathematically accurate to your footage's color science and will therefore yield far better results than bringing up the saturation and contrast sliders on your log footage. And for anyone saying it doesn't make a difference, I'm here to say that I think it does. Just take a look at this example. On the left, I'm using a proper log to Rec. 709 conversion method. In this case, I'm overriding the media color space here in Premiere. And on the right, I'm using the add saturation and contrast until it looks right method. So which one of these do you think gives you a stronger place to start your color grading process from? I think you get the idea here. Basically, if we're using a proper method, we're going to get a much better base to start from and a better final outcome. Okay, on to step two, find a reference. So what having a reference does is that it informs exactly how I'm going to adjust all the different color grading tools inside Premiere. In other words, it gives you something to aim at as you grade. So before I even touch any of the tools inside Premiere, I go and find a reference, and in most cases, if I've had a good pre-production process, I usually already have something I can grab from my project's pre-production board that I can grab nice and easily. But otherwise, the most common places I get references from are either frameset.app, Unsplash, Pinterest, ShotDeck, or most often my client's website or brand kit. And this is where another little juicy tip comes in. Whenever I'm doing client work, I always want to get the brand guiding colors from my client, because in most cases, the set design I've used will reflect their brand. Then when it comes to color grading, I can get those hues that my camera has shot perfectly in line with their brand colors through color grading. Here's an example. Here we see our subjects standing against this pink backdrop, and my client also has pink in their branding. So in this case, I got this color palette off my client and will bring it into Premiere to act as my reference. Now, as I grade this footage, I'll be able to attempt to match my pink backdrop to the exact hue of my client's brand colors, which is going to make this video look perfectly on brand. So with my reference ready to go, I then add an adjustment layer above my clip, as this is where all my color grading adjustments are going to go. And that brings us to step three, which is to assess and adjust white balance and tint. Okay, I want to stress that doing this step well is essential for a clean and high quality color grade. If your tint is off or your temperature doesn't match the mood that you're aiming for, your grade is going to fall short. So really pay attention when you're at this step. For me, this step begins with assessing, and there are some different approaches to this, but I like to begin by simply taking in and observing the footage in front of me. And from there, I gradually move both my temperature and tint sliders back and forth and aim to find the spot that looks the cleanest, the most color accurate, or just reflects the mood I want my footage to have. So this first subjective assessment of my footage is then followed by using a more objective approach that begins by opening up Lumetri scopes. To open these up, go to Window, Lumetri Scopes, and then make sure the scopes are selected in this dropdown, and then right-click in this area to choose the scopes you want. The two I like to use are Waveform RGB and Vector Scope YUV. Waveform RGB tells me about my exposure and whether any unwanted hues might be in my clip's highlights or shadows. And the Vector Scope tells me more about hue, saturation, and is useful for assessing skin tones. Now that they're open, I can do my objective assessment of white balance using two different techniques that I'll demonstrate for you. The first technique is to draw a mask around something white in your clips. These white shirts on our models are perfect for this, so I'll select my clip and then draw a mask around a small white area, so the rest of my clip disappears and we're only seeing this small white patch. Then I use the Waveform RGB to see if what I have selected is perfectly white. If I see either red, blue, green, or magenta popping out like this, I adjust my temp and tint sliders until all the colors that my waveform is showing me combine into a single solid white color. When my waveform looks like this, I know my whites are perfectly white. I then turn off my mask by clicking this effects button and then reassess the clip again subjectively. It's always good to confirm that the change you made using an objective approach also translates into being a subjective improvement. Now, what if you don't have anything white in your shot? This is where the second technique comes in, which is to create a mask of the skin tones by using HSL secondary. And just a side note, I have another video on my channel going into skin tones in depth, which I'll link below, so check that out if you want a tutorial on skin tones specifically. But once I have my skin tones masked in HSL secondary, which by the way will become useful later in the steps of my workflow when I deal with skin tones specifically, I ensure this little box is checked to color/gray and use Vector Scope YUV to see whether my skin tones fall nicely along the flesh line. Now, in case you don't know, the flesh line is this line right here, and it represents the hue of accurate skin tones for all ethnicities. If I observe that the skin tones are leaning towards either magenta or green, I can assume that other colors in my footage are also slightly off. So I then come back up to the temperature and tint sliders and make adjustments that bring the skin tones back onto the flesh line and therefore achieve better white balance and tint across my entire shot. As I mentioned before, I'll always follow up these objective assessment techniques with a subjective look over my footage to ensure the footage simply looks good to my own eyes and make any last fine adjustments to temperature and tint. And for high precision control with these settings, I can hold down the Command key and arrow up or down to make fine incremental adjustments. My next step, step 4, is curves. Here I'll often create a point in the highlights and one in the shadows to create an S-curve. This gives the footage contrast by lowering the shadows and bringing up the highlights and gives that first really noticeable pop to the footage. Now, a lot of people will stop at just creating an S-curve. I'll also often make adjustments to the white point up here and the black point. If I want a more high clarity sort of look, then lifting up the white point will do that. Whereas if I want something more soft and filmic, I can bring it down to create this soft highlight roll-off. And then for the blacks, I can lift them up to go more filmic, or I can bring them down to add more contrast. And of course, as I do this, I'm also looking at my waveform to see where my whites and blacks are sitting and ensuring I'm not bringing my blacks down too far into the muddy zone or clipping the whites. Next, step 5, basic corrections. I want the exposure, highlights, whites, shadows, and contrast to all be sitting at an optimized position. So I move each slider around until I find the absolute sweet spot. I'm using a waveform as I make these adjustments and checking that my clip has the desired level of contrast, which can be read by observing the distance from the whites to the blacks. Generally speaking, a shorter distance between whites and blacks means less contrast, and the more they're stretched apart, the more contrast you'll have. And another tip here, you never want to make anything so bright or dark that you lose details. For example, don't make your shadows so dark that you lose details in things like hair, and similarly, don't make highlights so bright that you lose details in the brightest areas of your shot like clouds. Okay, moving on, step 6, hue saturation curves. I come back into curves and go down to hue saturation curves. At this point, I take a moment to note each color and major element I have in the clip that I'm looking at. For example, in this clip, we have human subjects, so we have skin tones, and then we have this pink backdrop. And here's another example with a bit more happening. The main elements we have here are a human subject, meaning we've got skin tones again. The human subject is also wearing orange wardrobe, so we need to consider that. Then we've got the blue sky, the clouds, and some greenery. The point I'm trying to make here is that each and every element in my shot is considered as I move through each of the settings that allow me to adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance of any given component to my shot. The goal is to have every single color totally optimized in terms of its HSL settings. Let's use the clip on screen as an example. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have a reference prepared, and this is where it's really gonna start to guide me. So I can open that up here, and then I'm gonna go over to the hue saturation curves, and I'll aim to grab the hue of the pink background in my selection. Now, pink is quite close to skin tones, so I have to be careful to select only the pink background and protect the skin tones when I make these adjustments. First up, I want to desaturate this quite a bit. Then I'll adjust the hue ever so slightly to warm it up a little. Lastly, I'll bump up the luminance, and with this one, I have to be careful because if I push it too hard, I'll introduce noise and my shot will start to break, so I have to keep this in mind. For this shot, that's all I need to do, but if there was more elements such as sky and greenery like in this shot, I would need to spend some more time here adjusting those too. I then move on to step 7, Luma versus Sat and Sat versus Sat. This is also here in the curves panel, so just scrolling down here, we get to these. What I do here is adjust the Luma versus Sat by creating points at the second vertical line from the edges and then drop the ends down like this. I repeat this for Sat versus Sat, but this time come into the first vertical line from the edges. What this does is it removes any unwanted hues that might be coming up in areas of your footage, and it also helps to make your blacks become perfectly black and your whites perfectly white. So it's a powerful step when it comes to making your footage look as clean as possible. I pretty much do this in every single grade, but the main thing to watch out for is when you adjust the left side of the Sat versus Sat section, that your dark blacks aren't totally void of any color. I often find that if I'm grading footage of a model with dark hair, it can make their brown hair color black. If this happens, just ease off on this effect by not dropping the endpoint all the way to the bottom. Now we move to step 8, skin tones. And of course, this is for footage that actually has skin tones in it. And the tool I'm going to use for these is HSL secondary. Since I already created a selection of the skin tones from when I assessed my white balance earlier on, I saved myself some time here. But because I've made some changes to my shot, I want to first check that all my skin tones are still being selected fully. So to do that, I'll just turn my mask onto white/black mode and adjust as needed to make sure I've captured them as best as possible. From there, I'll change my mask view to color/gray and use the vector scope YUV again to assess whether the skin tones are falling along that flesh line. If the skin tones are falling towards the magenta style, I'll add a little green. If they're falling towards green, I'll add some magenta. These adjustments can be made either using the color wheels or tint sliders. Next, I assess the skin tone exposure and contrast. I often like to add a little bump to the highlights and a drop in the shadows to make the skin tones pop a little more. If you get overly orange areas of skin tones in the shadows, like underneath the neck, for example, I'll often bring some blue into the shadows and a little pop of red onto the highlights, and this just gives the subject color as it somewhat emulates blood flowing underneath the skin. And the last thing I'll be using the vector scope for is to assess the skin tone saturation, and typically I just ensure that the skin tones are not extending beyond 50% of the flesh line. In fact, I'm looking for something that's closer to 40%, which is ideal for skin tones. If they're slightly oversaturated, I'll use either the saturation slider to bring them down or cool them down using the temperature slider, which also acts to reduce saturation. So now that I've got the skin tones accurate and popping nicely, I will use the on-off switch to ensure I like the changes that I have made. Which, by the way, as I make any change to my color grade, I'm always asking myself, has this improved the look of the footage? This question is answered by toggling these checkboxes off and on again. At this point, my image is looking pretty damn good. Everything is color accurate and sitting where I want it, and if I wanted it to, I could deliver this to a client, but I want to take things into the premium zone, and this next series of steps is going to do exactly that. So step 9, which is just a quick one where I'll ask myself, do I want to add a vignette? In most cases, the answer here is yes, but I'm keeping it subtle. Usually setting it to just 0.1 or 0.2 is enough for me. Adding a dark vignette draws the viewer's eyes towards the center of the frame and gives a more contrasty cinematic feel to the shot. And going the other way and using a light vignette is better for high-key, brighter vibe projects. This is exactly what I'd use for the example here, where we have this pink background, and what I'd like to do is use my vignette to make the background more uniform so it has an even level of brightness going right out to the edges. So in this case, I'm adding a light vignette by moving my slider this way to do that. Now, this concept of repairing just the outside of my frame or the outside of this backdrop is actually the perfect segue into the next step of my process, which is step 10, selective repairs. This is where I'm selectively repairing anything that isn't looking good in my shot. Now, this one all depends on the shot you have in front of you. This is where I use tools such as masking in Lumetri Color or the Gaussian blur effect, or the content aware tool inside After Effects in order to make adjustments to small areas within the shot. Sometimes this involves retouching skin, removing blemishes from a product, removing tattoos on models, or anything else I don't want in my shot, and I can fix through a few methods, namely here in Lumetri Color. Now I want to illustrate this example with the shot we've been working with. And what I want to do here is make this colored background look totally uniform and even, because as you can see, we have this nice color right behind the models that matches the client's brand color palette. But as we move to the edges of the backdrop, the color becomes darker, more saturated, and it looks uneven. So the idea here is that we want to identify what the issue is and then fix it. So what I'll do here is come up to the top of my Lumetri Color panel, come into this drop down here and select Add Lumetri Color Effect. I'll click that and then open the drop down again, but this time rename it so I can keep things organized. In this case, a name that makes sense is Backdrop Fix, and while I'm here, I'll also rename my first Lumetri Color effect as Base Grade. Just use names that make sense to you and the changes you're making. Now coming over to Effects Controls, I can see the Lumetri Color named Backdrop Fix that I just added. With this, I'm going to click the Draw Mask tool and draw a mask that captures the edges of this backdrop so I can then selectively adjust the saturation and exposure of these areas only and keep the rest of my shot as it is. Now, since my mask will be drawn outside the edges of my frame, I need to set my view mode to 50% so I don't run out of room when I'm drawing this mask. With the mask drawn around the areas I need, I can then decrease saturation and boost up exposure to the areas within my mask until it takes on that more even look that I want in this example. As you can see, we've got this hard line, so an important setting to adjust here is the amount of feather to the mask so that it blends nicely together with the rest of my shot. So I'll dial in that setting in order to make that look nice and seamless. And as you can see here, that is looking heaps better. That background is much more even, and turning this Lumetri layer on and off really shows you how significant that change is. With any selective repairs I want to make now complete, I'm finally up to probably what everyone's favorite step is, which is to add a creative LUT. Now, a lot of people use stylistic LUTs actually much earlier on in their grading process, and this is something that I used to do too, but from what I've learned over time is that you just get such better results when you really dial in all your colors in your shot first and then apply a LUT. So that's why this is like the 11th stop in my workflow. And doing it this way just makes any LUTs that you own so much more powerful in terms of taking your grade to that next level. So let's begin. I'll come into the Creative tab and choose a LUT from my collection. In this case, I like Cine Clean, as this gives a super clean look that I find works really well in leveling up my grade across a wide variety of footage types. And at this point in the video, I want to shamelessly mention that these LUTs are actually from my own LUT pack, which I use within all my client work. Literally every time I'm grading, I'm using one of my own LUTs. And the reason for that is that there's something that I've developed over time to specifically suit the work I do, which is essentially product videos. But I'm not talking tabletop style product videos only. I also do work with models in the studio like you're seeing here, or even on location and outdoors. So these LUTs are super versatile, and I find there's always an option inside here that works for the project I'm working on. And overall, they just give things a lovely push in a cinematic direction without going too hard and overcooking my grade. Now, of course, you don't need to use my LUTs for this step at all. You can use any LUTs that you've got lying around, but if you think they might be a good fit to you, if you want to check them out, the link will be below the video. So I'll just grab one of these and then just finesse the intensity slider until I've got it perfect. Okay, on to step 13, LUT stacking. This one is totally optional, but adding another LUT is something I always consider, and I find I can create some really cool looks by blending different creative LUTs together. So to add another LUT and begin the LUT stacking process, I'll come up to the menu here in the top of the Lumetri Color panel and select Add Lumetri Color Effect. Then I'll choose my LUT that I want to stack. In this example, I'll blend a few different LUTs from my pack. I've already used what I call a cleaning LUT, which was Cine Clean, so now I think I want to go a bit more cinematic, and for that I can use Puma, and of course I'll get that intensity just right, and that's looking awesome. So I'll turn that on and off again to confirm I'm happy with the change that it made. And next I'm going to come up to the top here again and rename this according to the LUT I just added, so in this case I'll call this Puma. Now I can add another one by repeating that previous step, so add new Lumetri color, come to creative and choose another LUT. And in this case, I want something a bit more filmic. So in this case, I can use Crayola, which gives a more vintage film sort of look. And again, I'll dial in the intensity. And at this point, I'm super happy with the grade I've achieved. I've taken a shot that looked like this, turned it into Rec 709 footage that looked like this, and then graded it to end up with this result, which also aligns with my client's branding, so they're gonna be super stoked with it too. So now I have one clip graded to my own subjective perfection, where I've really focused on just getting this one clip as good as I can make it. Now I need to grade the rest of the clips in my video, which brings us to step 14, grade the rest of the video. The primary goal here is to make the video look cohesive, meaning there shouldn't be any shots that feel out of place in terms of color or exposure. I want consistency across all my clips. Here's how I do it. Because I've got my Lumetri color effects inside this adjustment layer, I can simply drag it to extend it over the rest of my video. At this point, I open up the comparison view tool by clicking here, and this tool is going to help me get a cohesive look across the entire video. The left side will show whatever clip you have at the start of your video, and the right is displaying the clip where your playhead is. Of course, you're probably going to want to change what's here on the left. So to do that, come into the timeline and go to whatever part of your timeline you want to use as a reference, copy the time code, and then paste it here. Now I can reference the clip I just spent all that time grading as I grade subsequent clips in my timeline. If there's a clip that needs some further adjustments, I use the blade tool to make cuts in the adjustment layer over that respective clip and then make the changes I need by going back into the base grade Lumetri color effect. In most cases, I only need to make slight adjustments to the settings inside basic controls and I can move on to the next clip. But of course, occasionally you will come across a clip that requires a bit of extra work. Finally, I'll watch my video back and inspect it to make sure everything looks cohesive and I'm happy with each clip, which then marks the completion of my color grading workflow. Alrighty, so for making it this far in the video, I actually have something for you. So if you've watched this video and you've been like, yeah, I really want to integrate that workflow for myself, I've actually created a free cheat sheet. So the next time you're color grading, it will help you remember each step and what to do. You can just open up this cheat sheet and refer to it as you go through all of the steps. So all of the steps in this video are outlined, but I've also included a few additional tips and tricks that I couldn't fit into this video. So if you'd like to get that, there is a link for you below this video. Right, so now you know color grading workflow that will help you make better videos for your clients. Perhaps you want to learn exactly what types of videos businesses actually want in the first place, so you can go ahead and be the one that offers it to them. And if that's you, go ahead and click this video up here or up here. Okay, on that note, thank you once again for spending some time with me. Thanks for your focus, and I'll see you in the next video.